So during an analysis period up to 2015, we found no positive MAT impact on student attainment compared to standalone academies. We also found significant differences by MAT size, and that's the read across. So students in small and mid-sized MATs tended to perform better on average than peers in comparable standalone academies and maintained schools. Conversely, secondary students in larger MATs of 16 or more schools tended to do worse than peers in comparable schools. So this suggested to us that the economic and policy drivers for rapid MAT growth at the time may well have been in tension with an educational argument for smaller, more diverse groupings of schools. That research titled Hierarchy, Markets and Networks also detailed from 4 locality studies, various forms of fragmentation from 2010, including, to name a few, firstly, what we called chaotic centralization, which we characterized as partially overlapping organizations in the bureaucratic hierarchy, holding diverse views and completing claims to authority, but actually with diminishing local knowledge about schools. Second, an increasingly commercial middle tier with services for schools being bought and sold rather than being provided on the basis of need. And third, increasing inequalities with high status schools seen to be benefiting from new opportunities and resources, while lower status schools faced a concentration of challenges, including undersubscription, higher mobility, and disproportionate numbers of hard to place children. And indeed, 2/3 of our survey responses in 2016, agreed that inequalities between schools were becoming wider as a result of contemporary policy reform. So that fragmentation and inequality are influenced not only by hierarchical governance changes, but also by how quasi-markets in state education are made up, is further explored in our recent report on the impacts of free schools on their neighboring schools. So we set out to test the chain of causation assumed in policy that the presence of a free school would increase choice and competition and thereby incentivize improvement in neighboring schools. We found briefly neighbours did on average experience a decline in student enrolment after a free school opened and often perceived competition. Competition did predict reported action taking by neighbouring schools, but competition related particularly to actions on marketing, promotion and recruitment, and to a lesser extent on accountability focused actions such as placing more emphasis on core subjects and student attainment in external exams, whilst competition did not predict internally focused actions relating more directly to the quality of teaching and learning. So analysing outcomes expected in policy, we estimated on student attainment in English and maths, no improvement in primary neighbouring schools on average, but a modest improvement in neighbouring secondary schools. Investigating this, we found secondary schools gaining a substantially more disadvantaged intake after a free school opened did not improve, while schools gaining a substantially more advantaged intake did, suggesting social selection was a mediator of free school competition translating into improvement in secondary schools. Analysing an outcome not expected in policy, social segregation, we found primary free schools were associated with a modest increase in social segregation locally, particularly in terms of student ethnicity. And we also identified conditions perceived to destabilize specific neighboring schools, including where they served a deprived context, lost students due to a free school, and were downgraded to below good by Ofsted just before or just after a free school opened. And this had the potential to start a cycle of decline, including by creating the need for those schools to cut staff and their curriculum. So looking across both projects, there's a range of implications for rebooting education. I want to highlight just a few that may not be touched on later. So first, we argue the government needs to reassess the assumptions it sets out on how choice and competition work in state school quasi-markets, which of course underpins so many policies. This should recognize schools rarely prioritize change and improvement and innovation in classroom practices when subjected to new market pressures. And quasi-markets also have the clear potential to incentivize selective competition, from which detrimental social outcomes can result. Second, current policy on school admissions and fair access needs to be reformed. In my mind, there's no clear basis for a school to act as its own admissions authority. And local authorities must have sufficient powers to fulfill their legal duties to arrange suitable education for all local children. Third, local services for the most vulnerable children need to be substantially rebooted. Schools have clear responsibilities here, but too many are now, in my mind, left to take on too much. So from speech and language therapy, mental health services to social services, schools need to be surrounded by really good quality and crucially accessible external service provision. And finally, as others have noted, there is a need for greater legitimacy in our school structures. Our findings highlight an increasing local democratic deficit in state education. We need a system of governance that secures greater trust and meaningful engagement for teachers, parents, and students. Thanks.